Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this IT governance webinar on anti-bribery management systems. The UK government passed the law, as all of you will have been aware, dealing with the need for organisations to put in place processes which would ensure that bribery was not something that would be part of how they did business. As a result of that law, BSI developed a British standard which organisations could follow as part of their strategy for dealing with the requirements of the Anti-Bribery Act, which of course applies to all organisations, not simply focused on organisations selling arms into parts of the world that buy arms. It deals with the challenges facing organisations doing business all over the world. And Alan C. Field, who has a host of experience and a large amount of practical knowledge of anti-bribery management systems, has developed for IT governance publishing a set of documents, a toolkit that enable organizations to set out to comply with the requirements of the Anti-Bribery Act without having to call in lawyers to create a completely custom and very expensive anti-bribery management system. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alan Calder. I'm the founder of IT Governance. Our original business was a publishing business, and that's now grown into a much bigger organization that deals with a wide range of products and services in the broad field of the governance of technology, and cybersecurity, of course, is a major part of IT governance today. But our publishing business continues to grow and expand into new areas. We have a very substantial business in documentation toolkits, templated documents that are designed for easy customization and deployment by organizations so that they can achieve their compliance requirements often at a fraction of the cost of calling in specialists to help them do so. And our toolkits continue to be a major part of our business, and toolkits such as our anti-bribery toolkit is a key part of how we help organizations take compliance forward in a cost-effective way. And I'm going to hand you over to Alan Field, who will introduce himself and will give you some of his background. He will then talk through the logic behind the British standard, how that can be used in meeting the compliance requirements of the Anti-Bribery Management Act. And we're then going to give you a live hands-on demonstration of the anti-bribery toolkit so you can see just how easy it is to click and customize, what we call one-click customization, to insert details and roles and responsibilities, document classification, branding, and all of those kind of components through a set of documents, which would enable you very quickly to put in place the documented part, at least, of a management system that demonstrates compliance with the requirements of the Anti-Bribery Management Act. So I don't think you need to hear any more from me. I'm handing you over right away to Alan Field. Alan, all yours.
Hello there, it's Alan Field again. I think we'll just come back to the agenda here because of a slight technical issue. So just to explain, this is the agenda that I think you've already seen on the screen, or what's contained in the webinar today. And so I'll go through all of these points. Hello again, it's Alan Field returning. And I think you've seen the agenda already, and we're just going to run through the webinar today with these various headings, which I'll explain to you, of course, as we go along. Now, bribery and corruption. Well, most organisations now do accept that there is some risk of bribery and corruption. It just doesn't happen to other people. But there are some organisations out there that maybe still feel that it isn't something that will ever affect them. You also need to consider that if one of your customers or one of your contractors or associates were involved with bribery, it could try to embroil you, in any investigation against them. And also to help you understand a bit about the level of corruption, there is a very interesting document called the Corruption Perceptions Index, published by Transparency International annually, which ranks every country in the world according to the corruption risks to be found, and there is a detail against each country as to what are the pluses and the minuses in the opinion of Transparency International. It's a useful document to look at if you need to explain to anybody the risks that may be there. The other very important point to remember is bribery is not necessarily a voluntary decision. Now, an intimidation of staff or indeed customers can arise, particularly in certain parts of the world, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. Anti-Bribery Management Systems, ABMS, is not just about compliance. One of the main reasons I would argue to put in an ABMS is to protect reputation. We can think of instances in the public domain at the moment where enormous reputational damage can be done to an organisation, and allegations of corruption can be one of the reasons behind that. Any management system, particularly an anti-bribery management system, can help minimise the risks of corruption arising. So what is BS 10500? It's an anti-bribery management system, specification devised by British Standards Institution, BSI, in London. It is a management system rather than a compliance system in the pure sense of the word. It was written in response to the Bribery Act 2010, which applies in the UK. And I think of the lists of matters it covers, the key one is the final one, failure of a commercial organisation to prevent bribery. So in other words, an organisation needs to have a policy or a system in place to prevent bribery. So in one sense, it's probably the widest legislation in the world relating to that. How this is interpreted is obviously a much more complex matter. However, BS 10500, because it's a management system, and those of you maybe who've had involvement with ISO 9001, the quality management system, will know that it's a very adaptable management tool, and you can apply it to other legislative systems in other parts of the world. BS 10500 is based on Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA as it's sometimes known. Again, started with ISO 9001. Some of you listening at the moment may be familiar with ISO 27001, the Information Security Management Standard, which also uses PDCA. And in essence, it's about top management setting policies, putting objectives, making sure those objectives are measured, and those measurements come out of the systems that are put into place. Sometimes also known as the circular process model or the Deming model, there's various names for it. But in essence, it's making sure that top management set the tone, set policies, and then make sure that those policies are eventually lead to further improvement and further development of the management system. Therefore, it's not a compliance system in the financial or corporate governance sense of the term. It's much more what I would describe as pre-compliance. It's about doing right things. It's about the right people making the right decisions. And of course, compliance systems and controls can flow from it or work directly in tandem with it, depending on the sector that you're in. If you're used to other management systems, you know that the policy statement is often something that is simply written and then put out to everybody. With BS 10500, that really isn't enough. The policy is very much the top management's view or commitment to anti-bribery. So in some instances, there will be quite a long period of time for the top management team to actually decide what its commitment and what its view is towards anti-bribery. because that probably is going to move into a wider business ethics. Not necessarily. Some people will say we're going to have a policy to comply with the Bribery Act or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act if they're involved in the United States, for example. But many people will say we want this to be wider than simply a compliance tool. We want to use this as a way forward to develop our business model, our business ethics, the way we do with customers and contractors and so forth. So there's a strong element of awareness which then has to cascade down, hence communication. And this obligation in 10.500 for every employee to sign the declaration, although that's important, can sometimes be quite a big logistical task as well, is really just the icing on the cake. Everybody should, by that stage, I mean everybody from the top to really the most junior person, should understand what the organisation's attitude to anti-bribery is. So this issue of the policy is very, very important. It's not just something that involves a kind of a cookie-cutter approach. Now, risk assessments. Risk assessments for an ABMS really relate to all of the requirements of BS 10500. So when you look at the standard, you'll see that there's specific requirements, for example, the way HR records are checked. That, in one sense, needs to be risk assessed just as much as the bigger picture issues of the vulnerabilities to corruption and extortion risks. Again, those of you familiar with information security management standards will understand this term vulnerability more than others, but it's really looking at how the organisation structures itself, delivers its service, controls every aspect of its operation. And in some business models, there will be greater vulnerabilities than others. The obvious vulnerabilities working in high-risk areas of the world or working in very high-risk sectors in relation to corruption. But there are also other aspects that one needs to look at, and obviously flowing out of these risk assessments, there will be lots of very useful and helpful general business improvements which aren't directly related to bribery. Again, I would argue this is all a part of pre-compliance. We're looking to mitigate risks before we have to start developing compliance tools to control them. And again, an ABMS that is effectively implemented does minimize risk. Due diligence, I'll call it DD. I'm one of those people that find that phrase difficult to say. DD is really an extension of risk assessment. As we say there, it's a systematic, ongoing process to look at customers and contractors to verify if they present an acceptable risk in terms of corruption. Now, there's many different ways of doing due diligence, and there's many different opinions, but the key thing is that there is a system in place. The key point I want to talk about there is no level of profit is worth unacceptable risk. Again, if we look at some of the cases at the moment in the public domain, often involving organisations with very, very large contracts where it is alleged that certain things happened that should not have happened. Again, was the decision made at top management level that no level of profit is worth an unacceptable risk? And that's really what due diligence is looking at. I also mentioned ongoing reviews of due diligence. DD can't just be done once and then say, oh, well, that's okay, we may have this customer for many years, it's no need to review them. A part of the PDCA approach would be to say there needs to be an ongoing monitoring or review of that arrangement with the customer. And obviously, again, depending on risk and depending on other factors, that may be done more regularly than others. The due diligence is a very important area of 10.500 and indeed anti-bribery compliance. Gifts and hospitality. Now, this could be a separate webinar in itself. It was one of the most controversial aspects of the Bribery Act when it was first enforced. In simple terms, there needs to be a clear policy for giving and receiving gifts and hospitality. There has to be a method for recording it. and then there needs to be an agreed process for management reviewing these records. In broad terms, if you have an open policy, there's no secret gifts, no indirect gifts or financial benefits, that the gift or hospitality is proportionate to the relationship you have with that person or organisation, that it's not being given or received for any purposes, then that is a good starting point. But many organisations, very, very reputable organisations at that, will have completely different policies to the way this is implemented. So what we aim to give you here is really just an overview, and the key point to make is that top management should never turn a blind eye to illegality or reputational risks. I call this involuntary bribery. It's the one that some organisations still find a bit difficult to accept. But there can be entrapment of staff, there can be blackmail, there can even be physical threats. Now, it's true that this tends to happen in certain parts of the world, but it can happen anywhere. And just because somebody is very trustworthy or very senior can often mean that they would be at the most at risk. And you can't assume it won't happen in your organisation. Risk assessments need to consider the risk. In some sectors and in some parts of the world, the risk may be considered very low indeed. Other parts of the world, it will be a completely different story. And as I've said there, staff really need to be briefed. It's often a part of general security training of what to do if they are put into a compromising situation, either personally or professionally, if they're threatened, or if anything else occurs where undue pressure is put on them. And as I said, specialist consultants may need to be employed to resolve complex incidents. This leads us on to the more general thing of investigations. BS 10500 requires procedures for investigating bribery, what's described as other weaknesses in the ABMS. Now, in reality, there are often close links to compliance here, particularly if there is an investigation process, often connected with counter-fraud or data security breaches. Some large organisations also put HR processes to deal with allegations of, for example, bullying, often can be adapted to the type of investigation we're talking about here. The process of how investigations will be managed, conducted and reviewed in that one little phrase can involve quite a lot of work. For example, decisions of when will we involve our lawyers, when might we involve the police, and when might we involve specialist consultants. All of this stuff needs to be decided before the system is fully implemented. Some organisations, as I've mentioned, do prefer to use in-house resources, but it tends to be where they already have, I say, processes in place to manage that type of scenario. It's not something really to try and learn on the job. If you read BS 10500, like many management systems, sometimes your initial reaction will be to say, oh, isn't this bureaucratic, or doesn't this involve a lot of paperwork? Well, two responses to that. One is if you aren't familiar already with 9001 or 27001, the document and data control principles will appear very similar to BS 10500. There are some specific record-keeping requirements, for example, on HR record-keeping, but most of these are quite useful and sensible in their own right. Like we should always take up references and use style and check on qualifications, etc. Obviously, the toolkit that IT governance has developed does help you with managing some of the document and data control principles in any case. But it's just something that one needs to bear in mind. So the toolkit itself, we're going to demonstrate a slightly enhanced version, in fact a very enhanced version, I should say, of the toolkit in a moment. But just to talk a little bit to you about the toolkit itself. There are quite a few products on the market to help you with the compliance aspect of anti-bribery, but not specifically for BS 10500, which remember is a management system until now. And as you can see, what we've done there is to put together a set of templates and documents to help you. And then there are some guidance documents as well, which I've written, which expand on the points that I've raised in the webinar this afternoon, to help you understand what some of the requirements mean and how they might be aligned with your own existing compliance processes. And I believe we now go to the demonstration itself. Right, so as you can see here, we've got the opening page of the toolkit, and essentially what's happened is it's now become more interactive, and we're going to start demonstrating to you some of the interactive qualities. Now, one of the advantages of BS 10500 compared to some products is that you have the concept of the compliance manager and you have the concept of the top manager. And essentially, although those roles may be covered by more than one person, there may be elements of delegation, in terms of controlling the documents and records, they really fall within one of those two broad classifications. And what happens in many organizations is that the compliance manager, BS 10500, works very closely in tandem with, for example, company secretary, HR director, head of internal financial audit, these obvious sort of areas where one would expect to see some crossover. But the compliance manager is responsible for the ABMS, and he or she then reports in to the top manager. And those of you who've had involvement with counter-fraud systems, often a similar scenario where normally a very senior individual, perhaps a chairman, perhaps the chief executive personally, will be the only one briefed on ongoing investigations until such points as they can then be advised to other senior members of the team. So we have some flexibility in how you adopt these tools, but as you can see here, you can put in your own details, you can change responsibilities for certain things to fit in with your own business structure, and whoever, say, may be delegated to do certain tasks. And naturally, you don't have to take these documents as they stand. They're there for your guidance. You can adapt them for your own purposes, and obviously you can extract things from them possibly for other purposes as well. So this is obviously quite an enhancement. Instead of just having a suite of electronic files, you now have something here that is more active. As you see, we've got tiers of documents, and as you click on each tier, you can see the various forms to put in place. Some have direct linkage with compliance, some are much, much more based on a management systems approach. And again, both types of documentation can inform one another. And I think that's going to be shown here, yes. And you see you can now populate that everywhere in the document. Yeah. The toolkit is split into, as you can see, the policies, and that gives you some guidance of what should be contained within the policy. Some quite interesting stuff in there, high standards of ethical behaviour, and as well as the ones relating to illegal acts, facilitation payments, and obviously a lot of this stuff here, if you were to look at this in detail, you would say, well, this will provoke quite a conversation, quite a discussion as to what we mean by some of these terms and what policies you want to pursue. So again, it's more than just something for you to extract. It actually gives you something to look at and to use as a starting point for more detailed discussion and analysis. We've got, for example, here a gifts and hospitality checklist, a very, very simple one, but again gives you a starting point, and you can look at this in relation to any policies you have. If you have no gifts and hospitality policy at all at the moment, it would be a very, very useful starting point. If you do have one at the moment, then you can check it against this to see whether there's anything you might want to change. And then you can see here, we've got a gifts and hospitality, and there we are. There's a description about the legal position here in Wales. It's very similar in Scotland, but it's very slightly different. And then, as you can see here, the plan should do check act approach. What we've tried to do with the guidance documents to show that this is a management system rather than a compliance system is to take the plan, do, check act approach. And we hope that that's helpful to you in actually coming up with the management system implementation. And as you can see here, we then have links, hyperlinks through to documents and procedures that we have written to support the guidance. And I think that shows you there what we've done. Okay, so measuring up, I've called this. Once you've implemented an ABMS, this can be externally assessed to see that it meets BS 10500 requirements, all the requirements of BS 10500. Now in the UK, there are currently 3 different certification bodies who provide this service BS 10500. If you already have ISO 9001 or ISO 27001 with one of those CBs, you can normally have a combined or an integrated assessment to combine or integrate those products with BS 10500. And IT governance will please give you some more advice on those options if you wish to know more. Assessment of BS 10500 has only recently started, really in about the last year, but certainly it is something worth considering, because as with all external assessments, it's proof that you can show to stakeholders, potential customers, that you do have a management system that meets 10500 requirements. So, more information. All toolkits, of course, you can go to the IT governance website, and also documentation toolkit information. You can see this here, and also it's likely that there'll be some other publications on the Anti-Bribery Management Standard coming over the next year or so. I hope you found this presentation helpful, and you find this presentation helpful, and I will be obviously very pleased to answer any questions that you may have about this webinar, or indeed the future publications that we're doing for you on ABMS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. That's been a most helpful and interesting presentation, even though we had that little glitch before. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, you were able nevertheless to get everything Alan had to say. You may well have questions that you'd like answered about the toolkit. The most practical way to pose questions without having the background noise of taking all off mute is for you to use either the chat function or the Q&A function. The chat function is available in the way that you've been using it. In the bottom of the screen, you can type a question into there, send the question, I'll pick it up, I'll read the question out so that everybody knows it, and Alan will then be able to answer the question. Alternatively, you can use the Q&A function. Q&A function is sitting up in your screen in the same panel. You can type a question into there, and I'll be able to pick the question up and feed it back to you. So questions about anti-bribery management, about the toolkit, about the British standard, any one of those areas, please do feel free to take advantage of the fact that you're on the webinar and that things seem to be working to pose your questions, as I say, through the chat function or through the Q&A function. I'll just pick up the questions as they come in order. So the first question that we had in was this: how many companies, especially those operating overseas, fall into the type of entrapments that you described? Alan, do you have any idea or any input you can give delegates on that?
It's difficult to have figures because, for one reason, if the entrapment would fall under kidnap and ransom insurance, the standard position in the kidnap and ransom market is that all negotiations have to be confidential. Now, there occasionally things fall into the public domain, but normally a lot of these issues will be resolved privately. We know from the Foreign Commonwealth Office Advice to Travellers, for example, there are certain countries where entrapment is a risk, and it's actually pointed out to potential travellers. In fact, the FCA website, and in fact the US State Department website as well, which is very, very similar in structure, is quite a useful thing to look at when you're doing due diligence to see what the particular risks in those countries are. In some countries it is pure entrapment, where normally a criminal will approach you in a personal situation and embroil you in a compromising situation and then attempt to blackmail you. And then in some parts of the world it will be much more along the lines of a public official, for example, refusing to release goods or documents or something like this. So it's difficult to be precise, but where there is a general security situation or security risk within a particular country, then you should be very cautious about ensuring that staff are briefed as to what to do if any such approaches are made to them. And obviously blackmail by its very nature is a difficult crime because people may be nervous of discussing it with their employees for the very reason they have been entrapped. So it's a little bit akin to whistleblowing, actually, that the company has to have a very clear policy that people will not be penalised for being honest about matters they've done which perhaps they shouldn't have done, because now this has escalated into something which is potentially much more serious. That I think is the best answer I can give, but certainly for the listener, look at the State Department website or the Foreign Commonwealth Office website on travel advice, and often you can pick up indications for certain countries where that's going to be a risk.
Grand, thank you, Alan. And the next question we have is, how would you quantify the metrics for measuring effectiveness of an ABMS?
The metrics really need to be decided by the organisation. I mean, some of the metrics will be very simple. How many people have signed the anti-bribery policy? and how many people are still outstanding. That would be a very simple metric. With risk assessments, if it's like risk assessments generally, have we defined all of the risk assessments we wish to do? Have they been carried out? Have any corrective actions or controls that have been indicated by that, have they been carried out? These are very, very straightforward type of corrective preventive action type approaches, which are common in virtually all management systems, which are part of the 9,000 family, if you like. But those will be the very, very basic metrics. And then, if you like, there's the softer or higher level metrics, what I might call vision metrics, where, for example, we define the policy and we define a set of objectives as a senior management team, and then say, well, that's the beginning. We want to see how this rolls out and can we make it better. So there's a bit of a trend at the moment towards, say, business ethics type policies. That's a very generic term, but organisations are looking at, for example, corporate social responsibility and another type of areas where they want to differentiate themselves from competitors by having a particularly ethical or forward-thinking, as they would see it, approach to the business. So again, some of that softer stuff can be measured by simply saying, these are our aims for the future, but we want to see how we're doing with the aims we define now. And again, this ties in very nicely with continual improvement as well.
Okay, thank you. 2 or 3 questions following a similar line of inquiry, so I'll just summarize them in the form of, are you aware of organizations outside of the UK that have either implemented or been certified against BS 10,500?
I'm not personally, although I know there are a number of organisations that are certainly interested. The certification bodies who are currently doing assessment work, I know, are looking longer term at marketing this through their offices in various parts of the world. And interestingly enough, some of the higher risk parts of the world seem to be taking an interest. And I think the reason for that is quite simple. If you're working in an area of the world where business standards are sometimes seen as different, say to those in the UK or the United States, then to differentiate yourself, it's very useful to say, we have BS 10,500. And indeed, some companies say that when they're doing due diligence, for example, doesn't mean you can't do work, for example, in West Africa or certain parts of Eastern Europe. You have to look at that particular project, those particular business partners, even the particular governmental partners you're working with, to say, is this a legitimate project? Is this something we can control? Is this something that's going to fit in with our overall ethical stance? So it can be done. So I think the short answer is yes, but not quite yet. I think there is a lot of interest bubbling around in certain parts of the world. So this whole notion of getting yourself badged up, if you like, in terms of your ethical approach to business.
Again, it's a worthwhile point for those of you who aren't necessarily aware of it, that the fact that it's a British standard doesn't place any geographic limitations on where in the world organizations can be that seek to comply with it, nor are there any limitations usually in terms of which certification bodies you can use, other than the fact they need to be accredited to certify against that standard. So, folks, I'm saying, if you have questions, please use the chat function or the Q&A function to type the question and send it in. Another question which comes in and it's slightly more financially oriented, which is, how would you measure the ROI, the return on investment, on implementation of an anti-bribery management system?
Well, I suppose there will be 2 key comments I would make. One is, of course, that everybody, if we're talking about UK here, everybody has to comply with the bribery act. So 10,500 in that sense can be a tool to help you ensure that you do comply with the Bribery Act. And we must always work on the basis that all organisations want to work within the law because of the penalties, both legal and reputational, that flow if they don't. So how one works out an IRI on that, I think, is probably down to individual sort of judgment of top managers. The second point, as I sort of alluded to, is that in some sectors there is a feeling developing, like construction project management is one that comes to mind, where people are saying, well, we can differentiate ourselves from our competitors, certainly in areas of the world where ethical business practice is now something which is becoming a topic of concern, of differentiation. And then I guess it's really down to saying, well, are we going to achieve more sales by having something like PS 10500? Or are we able to use it to publicise ourselves more effectively, perhaps get ourselves on tender lists that maybe we wouldn't have done before? So I think you can only answer this question in generality, but I would say those are probably the two key areas. And when I said earlier about getting badged up, I think that there's a positive spin to that phrase, is that it's not simply saying to the world, look, I've got a badge. It's actually saying we are now contenders, if you like, in certain markets that previously we haven't been. So I think that whatever tools an organisation uses to define the efficacy of its marketing budget fits in very nicely with 10500. So I have a way of answering that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're kind of coming to the end of what we'd allocated in terms of time for this, slightly overrun in total. One other question, are there case studies for cost and benefit analysis? I would think the answer to that is, Alan, that there are probably no case studies in place yet in terms of ABMS implementation.
Not cost benefit, no. On the BSI website, they used to have some case studies for, I think it was 3 clients, if I remember rightly, who had either implemented 10500 or had used some of its principles. So I know the BSI website certainly had those, but those were case studies, I think it's fair to say, very much in a marketing type mode. These were quite brief case studies, interviews, if I remember rightly, with some of the key players in the organisations. But they did explain a little bit about how the benefits those organisations receive from it.
Okay.
I think to be fair as well, this is a fairly new product, obviously, and therefore the marketplace is still finding the way that it sort of does these kind of financial analyses of it. I think at this stage, the issue of reputation, the issue of marketing differentiation are probably the key areas for people to focus on, rather than saying, is there a very, very hard financial payback on this? There may be in some instances, in others it may be more difficult to determine.
And I think that's often the case with management systems. The hard and fast financial payback calculations are very difficult because many of the benefits come in areas that are difficult to quantify, like increased market share, greater customer confidence, and so on. It's very difficult to put hard numbers on those parts of the equation. If you would like to get certified to BS 10500 in India, I would suggest probably, Alan, the organization to talk to would be BSI. BSI have a certification, arm certification arm in India. They would be able to help if you're looking for...
LRQA, I'm not sure if they are assessing in India at the moment, but LRQA, and then the other certification body is SGS, but I don't know again whether they're assessing abroad at the moment. But if the listener wants to contact those 3 CBs, then obviously, depending on what their timescales are, they can obviously get advice and quotations from all 3 of those CBs and see what they can be assisted. Yep. But at this stage, I think a lot of those CBs are assessing in the UK, but I think there is some interest in running assessments abroad. So I think the listener might just be interested to contact all 3 of them just to see what the timeline is on that.
So that's BSI, SGS, and NRQA are the three certification bodies. But folks, can I just remind you that before you even think about certification, a sensible thing to do is to buy one of these excellent toolkits.
Oh, of course, yes.
And to make your implementation process simpler, faster, and much more quickly compliant with the requirements of both BS 10500 and of the Anti-Bribery Management Act where you're subject to it. That brings us to a close. Alan, I'd like to say thank you very much for being with us today and making this presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for putting up with the slight glitch at the beginning of the program, but our continuity arrangements seem to have stood up to the test, which is always a relief. And I would like to wish you all a very best for the rest of the day. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan.